Hello, BookTube. This is Mike Frost, the Post Postmodernist Poetry Prognosticator. And I don't have a postmodernist poetry book that I'm reading here lately, and it's left me without a video in over a week. So I thought I would just give you a general idea of what I'm reading in March. Sorry, these glasses are seeming to dark up every time I get in front of the window here. Glasses darken up. Just a general idea of what I'm reading. I don't think I've ever mentioned this on this channel before, but I generally have 3 books going at the same time. I'm almost always reading a book of nonfiction, a book of fiction, and a book of poetry. I'm trying to concentrate on this channel on just poetry, what I read in poetry, but I do read other things besides that. And March, I've gotten involved in a few of these other readathons. March of the Mammoths, so I'm trying to read a Mammoth book I'll talk about. And mysteries. There's several channels doing mysteries this month, so I went back to some of my mysteries that I had on my shelf. So I thought I would start with some of the poetry, and then if this is all you're interested in this channel is poetry, you can just stop it when I start talking about the other types of reading that I do. So I started this month reading Thomas Foster's How to Read Poetry Like a Professor. Now, this is a reread for me. I've read it several times, but I take this kind of book, this book in particular, and others like it off the shelf every once in a while, just because my reading, as I read more poetry, my reading matures, and going back to these kinds of texts kinds of helps me evaluate that progress that I'm making in the depths that I reach in some of the poetry. But what I wanted to bring this book up for is Dalton over at Strip Cover Lit did a recent video. I'm going to link it below. He did a recent video teasing us about a series of videos he might do with Thomas Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor. Not this book, but the literature in the revised edition. I had read the original unrevised edition, but if you've never read that book, that is really mandatory reading. You have to read that book if you're a reader. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I don't think he does, Thomas Foster, I don't think he does as great a job in this book as he does in the one on literature. But if Dalton does do that series, you'll want to be a part of that, because that is a wonderful thing. But I'm reading through this just to keep myself updated on some of the stuff that I do in poetry. The poetry that I took off the shelf this month to do is H.D., Hilda Doolittle. She's an imagist poet. I don't know if I would say my favorite modernist, but she's got to be up there. Great, great writer. I don't think quite as appreciated as she should be. But I've read her poetry several times, and I love her poetry. But why I took her off the shelf is this month I wanted to start reading biographies more. It's an area that I have not gotten into before, but the more I watch BookTube and people that talk about the biographies, I thought I would give it a go. And there's this, so I grabbed this book here, H.D. It's a biography of H.D. I grabbed it. This one I started with for a very particular reason. Why I started with H.D. as an imagist. For those that may not be familiar with imagism, it's a modernist movement started by H.D. Pound, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, some of the others that were involved in the early Aldenton, when ended up marrying H.D. All these poets in the early part of the 20th century started a movement called Imagists. Now, a lot of these poets were in Europe, England primarily, talking about modernism and how they wanted to change poetry from a reaction from Romanticism into modernism. And they had a lot of ideas. Pound articulated this and became the spokesperson for this, and really about imagism by naming 3 things and keeping one thing basically secret. So the 3 things, now I'm going off memory here, so bear with me, but the 3 things was, one was to treat the object, whatever you're writing about, directly. Don't allude to it, don't use a lot of metaphors for it, but this specific item that you're talking about, whatever you're talking about, to treat it directly. I'll give you an example here in a minute. The second thing was to not use any extra words, is the way I think he put it. Nothing superfluous in the words. In other words, these romanticisms that just flourish with words and extra words. Cut all that out. Just the bare essentials. Only words that move and treat the subject directly in the poem. The third thing that he named was when you're writing, to use the musical phrase, I think is the way he put it, use the musical phrase rather than the metronome. In other words, free verse. So what he was advocating for was free verse. Not to use the da-dum, 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 da-dum of iambic pentameter or whatever, the iamb, da-dum, da-dum, or any other strictly metronome sort of thing, which the Romantics didn't do, let's face it. They used a lot of different variations in their poetry. But for Pound, in the way he was articulating this, is to use the musical phrase. In other words, have a sense of rhythm, but not a da-dum, da-dum, da-dum sense of rhythm. So it ends up being advocating for free verse. What comes out to be is free verse. The fourth thing that he refused to name publicly, but was talked about amongst the poets, was the one aspect of poetry that I really don't care for. It's in the poetry and a lot of poetry, but I don't really want. It's the inside joke kind of thing. It's the two or three poets, or a little group of poets, would know the other meaning behind the thing because they know the rest of the story. So, and a reader like you and I would have to know the biography of these poets. Hence why I picked up this one in particular for the Imagist idea. You would have to know the biography in order to get the inside joke, the rest of the story, as it were. Now, in reading a lot of the early modernist poets, what they call high modernists, if you will, I don't get that idea, but reading those, I picked up a lot about their relationships with each other. So a lot of this isn't news to me, but as I'm reading the biography, I am getting that other layer that's not normally open to just a general viewing. So I said I'd give you an example. So I'm just going to pick the very first poem, one of the ones that is just essentially identified with the Imagist movement's H.D.'s Sea Rose. Now, a sea rose is an actual plant that comes out of the sea. It's not in a rose like we think of a red rose. It is a sea plant, but it is formed somewhat looking like a rose. So it was called a sea rose. That's the name of the thing. So the first thing is to treat it directly, to name it. Don't use any extra words is the second thing. And then to use free verse, all of which this poem does. It's a short poem, so let me give it to you. Sea rose. Rose, harsh rose, marred with the stint of petals, meager flower, thin, sparse of leaf. More precious than a wet rose, single on a stem. You are caught in the drift. Stunted with small leaf, you are flung on the sand. You are lifted in the crisp sand that drives in the wind. Can the spice rose drip such acrid fragrance, hardened in a leaf? So that's Sea Rose by H.D. Hilda Doolittle is the full name. So as you can see, the first three there. It's free verse. It's when it's talking about the rose, it's talking about the actual sea rose. It's describing it directly. It's a harsh rose, marred with stinted petals, meager flower. It doesn't actually have a flower, but it's a seaweed kind of thing. Sparse, more precious than a wet rose. So it's treating the subject directly. So on that level, if you're just reading it to see what the image is, you can enjoy this poem as an image. It's just a straight up image. So on that level, it's a good reading. Now, of course, almost all poetry has another level to it. And a lot of poetry, like this poem, is a poem about poetry. So you could read it. Now, remember, this is a modernist poem. This is a rejection or a reaction to Romanticism. So when it's talking about the rose, it's a very romantic image. It's an image that was used throughout the Romantic era when they were writing those poems. There's 1,000 examples. I'm sure you read Red Rose and all that stuff. So it's a reaction against that. So it's talking about the sea rose. So little part of the twist here is that Romantics and modernists both were raised during the Industrial Revolution. The Romantics were in the cities. They saw what the Industrial Revolution was doing to people, and they turned their backs on that, went to nature to get their inspiration for poetry and to remind themselves of, the good old days. If you've ever lived on a farm, you know there ain't no good old days when you're farming. They would look out to nature and think, this is so wonderful to be out in nature. The modernists who lived in the same cities said, look, this may be different, but there is a beauty to the city. And they embraced urbanism. They embraced that sort of thing. So when it's talking about here that this twisted, acrid city life, in this case, sea rose, is more precious than the wet rose, the romantic rose that's out there, single on a stem, beautiful, because it's real. That's what the modernists were saying, was that because modern life is real, it's more precious than your imaginary romanticism. So that's that level there of a poem about poetry. That we could go further into that, obviously, but you get the idea. There's another level behind the just strictly image, and that's fine. The fourth thing that Pound kept talking amongst the other images about the inside joke, that it's the part that I don't enjoy about poetry, but the more you know about the relationship between H.D. and Pound and Aldington, her eventual husband, or at this time it was her husband, is that Pound and H.D., Hilda Doolittle, met in the States. They were kids together, basically, teenagers. And they were engaged at one point to be married. Now, H.D. comes from a religious family. Pound was a self-proclaimed troubadour. He's one of those, flourishing, big hats, I'm the poet kind of guy. He's kind of a ridiculous image, if you ask me. But because he had a genius for poetry, he seemed to be getting away with it. But his idea was to be a troubadour. So he wanted to have H.D. as a wife, but then have a lot of mistresses that adored him and, just run from woman to woman. And H.D., being raised from a religious family, was going to have nothing to do with that. So because of a controversy that happened in the States where Pound was basically thrown off a teaching job because he had a female in his room, he went to Europe. H.D. followed him to Europe, essentially to be engaged again, and it didn't work out because he wanted her to be either his wife so he could have mistresses, but he eventually married a woman named Dorothy Shakespeare. But in marrying Dorothy Shakespeare for the patronage of the inside lead to Yeats' whole story there, he wanted H.D. to be his mistress, and H.D. was having nothing to do with that. So there was a tumultuous relationship between the two. H.D. ended up marrying a guy named Aldington, who was also a poet, not a great one, but a good one. Meeting D.H. Lawrence, who wrote some really great Imagist poetry, but I don't want to get too far off the track here. But this poem is essentially, now in a lot of her poetry, H.D. compares Pound to a sea god. It's all over the place. You know how the sea gods were Greek gods. She does a lot of Greek mythology. The sea was something that could give 1 minute and wipe out whole navies in another. It's very tumultuous, and she compares Pound, and he's often compared to Neptune because, and in the images, in paintings and in her poetry, you see him from the waist up, not the waist down, sexual organs under the water, if it were. So this idea of being rejected from the sea, thrown out on the sand, is a reference to her relationship with Pound, the sea god. She's up on the sand, out of her element. But the wind is often zephyrs, and these are compared to Aldington, her eventual husband. In fact, he was a husband at the time that she wrote this poem. And she's being lifted by him in the sand. So that's the fourth element that is part of the Imagist poetry and the other forms of modernism that basically require you to know more about the poet to get the rest of the story. It's not a part of poetry that I enjoy. I don't think that you'd have to know more about poets to understand their poetry. It should be there on the page. There are poets that I like and I've read about. Tennyson, for example. The more I read about Tennyson, the more I like Tennyson, and it adds to my enjoyment of his poetry. But you don't have to know Tennyson's life to understand Tennyson's poetry. Other poets, like Robert Frost, the more I know about Robert Frost, the less I like his poetry. I like to think of Robert Frost as the little farmer out there in Derry, New Hampshire, writing poems as he's plowing his field. When you get to know who Robert Frost really is, he's not as sympathetic a character. So the more I get to know about him, the less I want to know about him. But anyway, that's where some of my readings are. So normally I read, it's a little different this year because I'm doing, or this month because I'm doing a couple of different nonfiction. So that's the end of the poetry kind of stuff. Now I'm also participating in several of the other readathons here on BookTube, one of which is the Mammoths. So I've had this book on my TBR for a very long time, David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. Now, I've read David Wallace's The Broom of the System, which I enjoyed. For those not familiar with David Foster Wallace, to me, now that you get some argument to the contrary, to me this is really the beginning of postmodernism, and because that's my primary area of interest, that's why I've always wanted to read this book. And I tried it a while back. I was actually in the military, and I started it, and then I got deployed somewhere. I think I went to Saudi or something like that, but I left the book behind, and then I just never got back into it. And it's a mammoth of a book. It's over 900 pages. It's not quite 1,000, but I don't think. Never actually looked. Yeah, a little over 900. So I've picked it up again, started reading it. So David Foster Wallace is the starting of, to my mind, now I'll get some argument to the contrary here, but to my mind, he's beginning of the postmodernist era, when we're getting rid of, or losing most of the irony associated with postmodernism. I'm going to link below a really great video. I haven't seen it in years, but I'll find it. An introduction to postmodernist literature. To give you an idea here, what I'm referring to, and maybe tease the video below. If you think of high art and low art as equally valid, in other words, literary fiction and genre fiction as both being valid, that's a postmodernist idea. If you think you can get as much out of Pride and Prejudice, which is another book we're reading, the mandatory reading from Steve Donoughue this month, and comic books, you're a postmodernist thinker. If you've watched all these movies, Marvel movies, and enjoy those as much as you enjoy some of the more serious, I'm going to put that in quotes, movies, then you're a postmodernist thinker. If you have lost the taste for irony, I mean, I'm just bitter type, always, I'm better than everything else, and this is all useless. We're all just going to die, so why bother anyway? If you're tired of that kind of thinking, you're a postmodernist. You're no longer in the ironic postmodernist era in your thinking. And if that's teased you enough, I'm going to link below, if he's still on YouTube, I sure hope he is now that I've committed myself, introduction to postmodernist, to some of the text that might bring you. David Foster Wallace, I think we've gone beyond, but because he, to my mind, was the beginning of my mind, it was of postmodernism, I'm going to read this book. And I'm about a third of the way through it, and I'm enjoying it. It's not my normal read. Generally okay. So when I read 3 books, I normally, if I'm reading a very stringent or tough poet to get through, like HD, I normally read something light in my fiction. in order to kind of balance my brain because I can't take too much of this serious thinking. So I'll read something light. I happen to be looking at my collection of steampunk, one of my favorite genres. So I'll read a steampunk novel if I'm reading HD, but this, because it's the March of the Mammoths, I'm trying to read this Mammoth book. And I'm going through it. I'm enjoying it. I don't think I'm going to finish it by the end of the month. I'll be perfectly honest with you guys. Some of these guys are reading like 2-3 Mammoth books this month. I can't do it. I'm not there. Maybe I'm reading too slowly or too far into it. But I just to pick up more than one Mammoth. I'm not Steve Donoughue. Speaking of Steve, he's got his mandatory reading of Pride and Prejudice. This is a reread for me, but I am enjoying it. We are at this stage. We've passed the initial ball that's in it, but if you're in this readathon with Steve, and it's mandatory, so you must be. That ball to me was one of the highlights of this type of literature. So much happens at that dance that foreshadows everything else, that if you truly got every nuance out of that one section, that one chapter, some more than that, if you got all the nuances out of that, you got the rest of the book. You don't know it yet, but you got the rest of it. And I love when an author does that. It's just, you don't know it until later. And then you reflect back on it and you're like, oh, that was there. It was foreshadowed. That to me that's the mark. And then from there, when you look back, you get to see the genius of all the, talk about every phrase matters, every word matters, every image matters, every relationship where they're standing matters. Okay, so this is Steve's mandatory read. I'm keeping up with this one, which is costing me a little of the David Foster Wallace, but it's Jane Austen. You gotta. And it's Steve Donoughue, so you'll find out. The other parts was the mysteries. I started the first week, I read Victoria Thomas's Murder on Astor Place. This is the beginning. I picked up, because I hadn't read her before. I read a lot of steampunk, and these are what they call gaslight mysteries, which are related. I think they both take place in the early 1900s, but this is not I guess it is alternative history in a sense. These are not real people, but it doesn't have airships and other kinds of things that you would find in steampunk. But this is as close to a steampunk kind of mystery, which I enjoy. But I decided to go a little bit outside of my normal reading to do that. So I picked up a couple. This is the next book in the series, and this is later down the side. But Astor Place was the first one. Sarah, the main character, is beginning her relationship with one of the sergeants on the police force as they solve a mystery together. Several murders, actually. I got to tell you all right, spoiler alert, I guess. I didn't enjoy this book, not because it wasn't well written, but because of the nature of the crime. I don't know if I told anybody on this channel, but I was a cop for 20 years, military police officer. My stint in the military was as a law enforcement officer, so I've done criminal investigations and things like that. And there's just some areas of crime and criminal investigations that are so distasteful and this brought back some of those memories. So through no fault of her own, but just because I've got a history of investigating the types of things that happen with the antagonist in this book, I didn't enjoy it, but please don't take that as a fault of the author. That's just, some crimes just bother me. Which is why I didn't go to the next book in the series, and I picked up something else that I had not read last week. Rex Stout's the Nero Wolfe mysteries. Now, I can't say that I'm a great mystery reader, but I do read quite a few mysteries. But I never read any of Nero Wolfe's, the books about Nero Wolfe by Rex Stout. And I think because I remember watching the TV shows, Nero Wolfe TV shows. I think Raymond Burr was the lead, and I just didn't enjoy him. I didn't enjoy it, so I never had an inkling to do that. Even though I've been told many times after watching those shows that the actual books were very different. So I decided I'd pick up. I got the first couple, and the first one is, which I read last week, was Fer-de-Lance. This is the second book in the series, but I left the book I just read in the car, and my wife has left, so she left with the car, so I don't have it to show you. This is the second book in the series, and I'm on that one now. It's very different than the movies or the TV shows that I remember with Nero Wolfe, with Raymond Burr. And somebody else recommended another series of Nero Wolfe. They said it was much closer to the books. And it's escaping me now because I don't watch a whole lot of TVs and I don't know these people's names. I'm sorry. So TV stars. But it's an old TV show, I guess. So I don't know how many people would be familiar with them, but there is, I guess, a show out there that is closer to the actual characters in this. I'm enjoying these immensely. The wonderful thing I think about this compared to this, so in this we're developing the characters, Astor Police. You meet the main characters and they're developing their relationship. In this one, from the very first, the relationships are already established, the characters are already established. You just jump in the middle of their relationships and they're picking up a case. So essentially with a collection like this, you don't have to go from book 1 to book 2 to book 3. You could pick up any book in the Nero Wolfe series and you're fine. As I understand, because I have not read them, as I understand, there's a slight change in tone as they go post-war time frames, but not so much that you would notice unless you've gone through the series, which I intend to do, is to go through the entire series because I'm enjoying it. So I'll keep going as long as I continue to enjoy it. And that is all for this month's reading so far. I'll find a postmodernist poetry text to talk about, hopefully soon. I am looking forward to several books that are coming out, and I have on order several books. I'm trying to get caught up on some of my African poetry knowledge because I'm woefully lacking in that department, and there's, as I understand, some great poetry coming out of Africa. So I am woefully undereducated in that department, and I'm trying to pick up on that. Other than that, I will talk to you as soon as I get another text to move. And if we don't, maybe I'll just stop by and tell you what I'm reading and how things are going in general. All right. Thank you, BookTube. Thank you for spending time with me today.